So, hello everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to take part in the Delta Trend Days 2022, even if I'm not able to be there in person. Today, when you see this, I will be in Vietnam, in Nha Trang, running a workshop on various kinds of development-related issues there. You've heard a lot of stuff during this day about the US and China and decoupling and stuff like that. I'll talk a little bit about the EU and Asia, and it's necessarily going to deal quite a lot with EU and China, because China is such a big part of East Asia and affects the European Union in such a distinct manner. To make sure that I don't miss anything, I'll start out by just stating my main points, and I'll try to prove these later, or at least give some evidence in favor of them. So the first is that the challenges in the European Union's economic and political relations with Asia largely have to do with China. And we have a massive trade deficit with China. We have serious imbalances in the investment relations with China. And there are also asymmetries in the political decision-making process that makes it difficult for us to handle a big counterpart like China. So that's my first point. My second point is that there may be reason to be slightly optimistic when it comes to the massive trade deficits. I think that China's abnormal trade competitiveness will gradually diminish over the coming years. But I also think that imbalances in investment relations will remain a severe concern for quite some time to come. And then my third point is that, as you've heard, there are signs that China may be preparing for some kind of decoupling, and there may already be some dimensions of decoupling in the US-China relations. I think that perhaps the EU is also looking for ways to treat China as a special case, maybe not decoupling, but a special partner rather than the typical partner that we have in Asia. So the first bit of evidence is here. This shows the massive trade deficit that the European Union has had with China for the past decade or so. Actually, this trade deficit has been there for a longer time, from at least the late 1990s. And we are talking in the last couple of years about 240 billion euros, which is really fantastically much. It has increased during the pandemic period, but the main reason for that is probably that the European Union has recovered better from the pandemic than what China has done. The lockouts or lockdowns in China that continue until today are restricting Chinese demand and also Chinese imports. To understand how this is going to work out in the future, I think it's necessary to look at the reasons for China's enormous export competitiveness. And I think that there are many ways of explaining the Chinese export miracle. Let me start with a structural version of the explanation. There's been a lot of talk about whether China has undervalued its currency and that this kind of misalignment is the reason for why they are so competitive. Chinese products are cheap because Chinese currency is cheap. I don't think that is the case. I think the more severe undervaluation is an undervaluation of the Chinese cost of labor. And there are structural reasons for that. The first reason is that the labor supply in China has been really massive over the past decades. The first reason is that there's been a pool of surplus labor in rural areas, in the inland parts of the country, people who have been working at very, very low income levels in agriculture and who've been very happy to take on jobs in the coastal export zones, even at low salaries. And that pool of surplus labor has allowed Chinese export industry to expand at a very low cost. Demographics have also played a role in this. Because of China's one-child policy and the miserable years in the 1960s, China has been characterized by a situation where almost everybody is in the labor force. There are a few old people, and also the cohorts of young people have been small because of the one-child policy. If we combine this with restrictions on the bargaining power of labor, there are no independent trade unions or labor unions in China. There is no political party promoting labor interests in China. And the national development strategy has been based on export competitiveness that requires low wage levels. We can see the result as a severely underpaid working class. In capitalist economies, GDP is divided by capital and labor in such a way that capital gets 1/3 and labor gets 2/3. In China, it's been the opposite. Capital has 2/3 and labor has had only about 1/3 of GDP. This reflects the unnaturally low labor costs in the Chinese economy. I will just show one picture on this, and this is China's population pyramid in the year 2010. In that year, the average Chinese was 33 years old, and you can see that the biggest cohorts are not the young people, which we usually have in a typical population pyramid. The biggest cohorts are middle-aged people that are already in the labor force. This can be compared, if we want to make a really dramatic point, can be compared with a real population pyramid, and that would be India the same year. Look at the difference. Everybody in China is in the labor force, and that gives a big supply of labor and low labor costs. There's another way of explaining the Chinese export miracle too, that will be very familiar to those of you who have studied macroeconomics. And basically that view says that Chinese export surpluses are huge because China has had huge savings. And underpaid labor, of course, is part of the story because capital owners have higher savings rates than workers. But we have also had demographics contributing to it, a high working age ratio, many people in the labor force for each one who is not in the labor force, means that households have had funds left in their budget after the necessary consumption has been taken care of. That capital has been available for savings and eventually investments, and then an institutional setting that has contributed to very high household savings. The costs for education, healthcare, elderly care, and pensions haven't been covered really by the public sector. Private savings have been absolutely necessary to cover these kinds of expenses. And perhaps the high cost of real estate in the major cities is also a contribution to this. The macro nerds will recognize the equation at the bottom of the page, or it's actually not an equation, it's an identity that says that the internal balance of an economy, the savings investment balance, is per definition always equal to the external balance, which is basically the current account. So if you have a lot of savings, you are likely to have an export surplus. I think that the end of this cheap labor era is in sight. It's not perhaps here yet, but we're moving in that direction. And one reason is that we've reached what has been called the Lewis turning point, the point where the pool of surplus labor in the rural areas has been exhausted, and that where you have to offer higher salaries to attract more people to the manufacturing sector. Demographics will also play a role here. And of course, the reason is the aging population. In addition, we should remember that Chinese people don't normally work until they're 70 unless they're in the party and government and various commissions. Chinese pension ages are lower than in Europe. And then there are increasing demands from the working class. The inequality between workers and capital owners has become massive, dramatic in the Chinese case. And this worries the Communist Party. So they would like to avoid social polarization in order to maintain what they call a harmonious society. And this is going to contribute to raising the labor incomes in the next few years. So my prediction is that trade surpluses should diminish if China continues importing. The last few years, the pandemic years, the trade surpluses haven't diminished, but the reason is that Chinese imports for consumption purposes have been very, very small. When it comes to the investment imbalances, it's not so much a question of investment volumes, but rather investment conditions. So my arguments are the following. We don't have to really look at volumes of foreign direct investments, neither stocks nor flows, because the Chinese investments in Europe increased dramatically over the past 20 years, and now we're roughly equal. However, the investment environment differs a lot. Chinese restrictions on foreign direct investment and the operations of foreign firms are much more severe than EU regulations on foreign companies investing in the EU. We should say that there are some FDI screening procedures that are now introduced, but even taking these into account, Chinese investors in Europe have a lot more freedom to do what they want than European investors in China. One example is that most of the Chinese FDI projects in the EU are acquisitions. Chinese buy already existing firms with strategic assets, technology, or something like that. European investors going to China hardly have a chance to acquire that kind of assets. So European firms, to a much larger extent, have to rely on greenfield investments. And I would argue that there are no clear signs of a more level playing field, despite reductions in Chinese FDI restrictiveness. And the reason here is that China doesn't need formal rules to control foreign investors. All the formal rules can look good, but the party has ways of steering economic activity anyway. The state-owned enterprises and their dominant position in China is one reason. Another reason is the recently implemented rules on Communist Party cells in all large enterprises. These party cells have to give their okay to all major corporate decisions before the board of the enterprise does that. And this means that you don't need national level regulations in order to steer the development of economic activity. And let me give some data to support these arguments. So this is the value of the cumulative FDI stocks between the European Union and China. The chart goes only up to 2017. I couldn't find any newer ones, but not all that much has happened during the pandemic years. And in particular, there hasn't been a great imbalance between Chinese investments in Europe and European investments in China. So we're at roughly the same levels. This chart shows the Chinese investments in Europe in the past decade divided between mergers and acquisitions and greenfield investments. And you see that the light blue or turquoise part, the greenfield investment part, is very small, although it has increased a little bit in the last couple of years. Chinese enterprises are acquiring already existing firms with important assets in Europe. European firms are not able to do the same in China. And here we have some illustrations of FDI restrictiveness. This is an index based on what kinds of rules and regulations you have, what kinds of restrictions on the operations of firms. In every major industry, except for real estate, you see that China has stricter regulations on foreign direct investment. These things are problematic, and the European Union would really like to do something about them. The question is, can we ask the Chinese to treat our investors the same way we treat Chinese investors? Can we negotiate for reciprocity? My pessimistic answer here is that probably we can't. We don't have a lot of bargaining power. And one of the reasons for this is that Europe doesn't really have a common China policy, but instead many different views on how we should treat China and what we want from China. And this variety of views is related to differences in political agendas because of differences in what we already do with the Chinese. So it has to do with the bilateral trade relations with China. It has to do with the inflows of foreign direct investment from China. It has to do with ambitions regarding market access in China, and also the ability to manage competition from China. In all these four dimensions, we see differences between European countries. and therefore differences in their attitudes to China and their willingness to be critical and to force the Chinese to open their market. This contrasts a lot with the situation in China, where China is able to pursue one single strategy, and after the Party Congress this week, it's very clear that this is Xi Jinping's personal strategy. This chart shows the bilateral trade balances between different European countries and China, and you see here that only 3 countries recorded surpluses in trade in 2020. Most countries had big deficits. The Dutch deficit of 75 billion euros is an exaggeration, and that has to do with the fact that most ships coming from China dock in Dutch harbors, and therefore the imports are registered on the Netherlands. A lot of it continues to other European countries. But the question here is, can Germany and Hungary have the same opinions about China, given the very different starting points? This chart here shows the inflows of Chinese foreign direct investment to various European countries. And this is not an equal distribution across countries. The Baltics, for instance, have hardly received any Chinese investments, probably because firms are still too small to be interesting for the Chinese. The UK, Germany, France, Italy, and strangely enough, Finland are among the places that have received foreign direct investment from the Chinese. These differences generate different political opinions. Already about 10 years ago, there was a lot of study on how European countries differ in their attitudes to China. And this chart shows the one of these distinctions between a group of countries in the upper right-hand quadrant that are less willing to be critical to China, but more interested in what the Chinese are doing in Europe, and more interested in receiving support from China in the form of investment or credits or whatnot. The bottom left-hand quadrant shows a number of countries that are prepared to be critical and play a tougher game against China, partly because they are interested in getting access to the Chinese markets, both for their exporters, but also for companies wanting to invest there. And agreeing about exactly what one should do is very difficult here. We have been trying. If you remember, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of discussion about a comprehensive agreement on investment between the European Union and China. It could have perhaps leveled the playing field for these two locations, but it fell through. The European Parliament did not want to ratify this agreement, and the Chinese also backed out. So we really don't have any way of handling these imbalances in the investment regimes. But maybe Europe is trying to do something else. And this is my final point here. Maybe we should see the European Union's trade agreements in Asia as part of an alternative strategy. So what we see is a series of free trade agreements that typically also contain investment rules and regulations, competition policy, gender issues, and environmental regulations. We have seen, or we have active free trade agreements with South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and Vietnam today, and then negotiations with a lot of other countries in Asia. Maybe what the European Union is trying to do is to actually encircle China with these various free trade agreements, so that we can, in a few years, decide that China is almost the only country that only has the WTO regulations to rely on, whereas everybody else has more favorable access to the European market, more close cooperation, and integration and coordination of rules and regulations with regard to investments, competition policy, and other kinds of issues that are difficult to deal with within the WTO framework. That is my prediction. China will be a special case in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.